Picture this: a moonlit night in 1791 Haiti, the air thick with the scent of sugarcane and the quiet tension of whispered plans. Beneath the shadows of the plantation, enslaved people move silently, their hearts pounding not just with fear, but with something far more dangerous: hope. This wasn't just another night. It was the beginning of a rebellion so powerful, it would tear apart empires and rewrite the rules of history. Yet how many of us know their names? How many of us realize that the fate of nations often hinged on the courage of those who were told they had no power at all? History books love to celebrate the battles won by kings and generals, but what about the revolts that truly changed the world? The uprisings led by enslaved people, brilliant, organized, and relentless, didn't just challenge their oppressors. They shattered entire systems, toppling economies and forcing empires to their knees. These rebellions weren't just footnotes. They were earthquakes, sending shockwaves across continents. Yet so many of their stories have been buried, dismissed, or simply forgotten. But what if we've been missing the real turning points all along? What if the fall of mighty powers wasn't decided in marble halls, but in the dirt and sweat of plantations, where the oppressed refused to stay silent? That's the journey we're starting today, one that will take us from the sugar fields of Haiti to the shores of Jamaica, from the heart of South America to the corridors of European power. We'll uncover the strategies, the leaders, and the moments of sheer defiance that forced history to bend. These weren't just fights for freedom. They were revolutions that reshaped trade, politics, and even the idea of human rights itself. And by the end, you'll see history in a way you never have before, not as a story written by the powerful, but as a tapestry woven by the resilience of those who refused to be erased. So let's begin where empires first trembled, with a spark that became an inferno. The Haitian Revolution didn't begin with a single battle or a dramatic declaration. It started with something far quieter, a secret meeting deep in the forests of Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people, their backs still marked by the lash, made a vow under the cover of darkness. By 1791, the French colony was the richest in the world, built on the backs of nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans who harvested sugarcane under conditions so brutal, death was often a relief. But that year, the unthinkable happened. The oppressed became the unstoppable. Leading them was Toussaint Louverture, a man who'd once been enslaved himself, but whose brilliance as a strategist would outmaneuver empires. He didn't just rally an army, he trained former slaves to fight like seasoned soldiers, turning the very tools of their oppression, like plantation machetes, into weapons of liberation. And when Napoleon, the most powerful man in Europe, sent tens of thousands of troops to crush the rebellion, Toussaint's forces did something unprecedented. They won. Not just a battle, but the war. By 1804, Haiti became the first black republic in history, a nation born from the ashes of slavery. The shockwaves were immediate. Napoleon, humiliated and financially crippled, abandoned his dreams of a French empire in the Americas. Desperate for funds, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for pennies, a decision that doubled the size of a young nation and reshaped the continent. Historians still debate whether America's westward expansion would have been possible without Haiti's revolution, but the impact went deeper than land deals. For the first time, enslaved people everywhere saw proof that freedom wasn't just a dream. The Haitian Revolution became a rallying cry, from the cotton fields of the American South to the docks of Liverpool, where abolitionists pointed to Haiti as irrefutable evidence. Oppression wasn't inevitable. Yet for all its world-altering consequences, This revolution is often reduced to a footnote in textbooks. Why? Because those in power feared its message. When Haiti demanded recognition as a sovereign nation, France, backed by other European powers, forced it to pay crushing debts compensation for the lost property of slaveholders. It was a cruel irony, the first Black Republic, born from freedom, shackled by economic chains designed to strangle its future, but the truth couldn't be buried. From Jamaica to Brazil, whispers of Haiti's victory ignited rebellions that, though less known, were no less transformative. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were calculated strikes against an unjust system, proving that even the mightiest empires could be brought to their knees by the courage of the oppressed. South Carolina, 1739. The humid September air carried more than the scent of pine and swamp water. It carried a defiant chant, rising like thunder from a column of nearly 100 enslaved Africans marching down the road near the Stono River. Armed with stolen muskets and waving banners that demanded liberty, they weren't just running, they were waging war. The Stono Rebellion, America's bloodiest slave uprising, wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was a meticulously planned strike for freedom, timed to coincide with a holiday when white plantation owners would be distracted. Their destination: Spanish Florida, where promises of emancipation lured those desperate to escape British tyranny. For miles, they moved with purpose, burning plantations, freeing fellow enslaved people, and leaving a trail of defiance in their wake. But what's often overlooked is their strategy. They didn't move in silence, they drummed, they sang, turning their march into a declaration of humanity in a system determined to deny it. When militia forces finally caught up with them, the clash was brutal. Dozens were killed, their bodies left unburied as a warning. Yet the rebellion's true impact wasn't measured in lives lost that day, but in the seismic shift it triggered across the colonies. Terrified lawmakers responded with the Negro Act of 1740, a draconian set of laws that banned drums, gatherings, even learning to read anything that might foster unity or resistance. Archaeologists tracing the rebellion's path have uncovered chilling evidence, fragments of pottery near abandoned plantation sites, suggesting secret meetings where plans were forged. These artifacts whisper of a network far more sophisticated than history books admitted. But the Stono Rebellion did something even more profound. It exposed the fragility of a system built on fear. Plantation owners, once confident in their control, now slept with weapons under their pillows. The myth of the contented slave crumbled, revealing a truth that would echo for generations. Oppression fuels resistance. And here's the unsettling question: did Stono plant the seeds of America's racial reckoning? The rebellion didn't just prompt harsher laws, it deepened the gulf between enslavers and the enslaved, hardening divisions that would eventually explode into civil war. Yet Stono was just one thread in a global tapestry of defiance. From the jungles of Suriname, where escaped slaves built independent communities that outmaneuvered European armies, to the docks of Rio de Janeiro, where Muslim-led revolts shook the foundations of the Portuguese Empire, enslaved people were never passive victims. They were strategists, diplomats, even journalists like Oloda Equiano, whose published memoirs turned British public opinion against slavery. These rebellions shared a common thread. They forced empires to confront the lie that their wealth was built on anything but violence. When Jamaica's Baptist War erupted in 1831, led by the charismatic preacher Samuel Sharp, it wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a moral earthquake that galvanized British abolitionists. Within 2 years, slavery was abolished across the empire. Coincidence? Hardly. The enslaved didn't just resist, they rewrote history. And as we follow their footsteps beyond the Atlantic, the scale of their influence becomes undeniable. not just in the battles they fought, but in the world they forced into being. The marshlands of southern Iraq in the 9th century seemed an unlikely place for an empire to meet its match. Yet for nearly 15 years, the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most powerful regimes in the Islamic world, found itself locked in a desperate struggle against an army of rebels who had once been dismissed as mere laborers. These were the Zanj, East African slaves forced to toil in the brutal salt flats and sugarcane plantations of Mesopotamia. Their backs bent under the sun, their hands cracked from draining marshes. They endured conditions so harsh that death might have seemed a reprieve. But in 869, they chose a different path, rebellion, led by a mysterious figure named Ali ibn Muhammad, who preached that their suffering was not divine fate but a crime to be overthrown. The Zanj transformed from scattered workers into a disciplined fighting force. They didn't just riot, they built a fortified city deep in the marshes, a labyrinth of canals and earthworks that turned the terrain itself into a weapon. When Abbasid troops marched in, expecting an easy victory, they found themselves bogged down in a nightmare. The Zanj mastered guerrilla tactics, ambushing supply lines and vanishing into the reeds, their knowledge of the land making them ghosts to their enemies. Arab chroniclers later called it the War of Exhaustion, a grinding conflict that drained the treasury and morale of an empire accustomed to swift conquest. What made the Zanj Rebellion so extraordinary wasn't just its duration, it was how it exposed the hypocrisy of an empire built on slave labor. The Abbasids relied on thousands of enslaved Africans and Turks to staff their armies, farms, and households, yet pretended their power came from divine favor. The Zanj shattered that illusion. At their peak, they controlled key trade routes and even minted their own coins, a stunning act of defiance that proved they weren't just fighting for freedom, they were building a new society. But the rebellion's ripple effects reached far beyond Iraq. In the ports of the Indian Ocean, where enslaved Africans were trafficked by the thousands, whispers of the Zanj success sparked unrest from Oman to Zanzibar. Sailors, often enslaved themselves, began sabotaging ships or steering them into rebel-held territories. The Abbasids weren't just fighting a war, they were watching the machinery of their economy, built on the backs of the oppressed, begin to seize and splinter. And here's what history books often miss. The Zanj Rebellion wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a thread connecting uprisings across the medieval world. From the docks of Basra to the sugar plantations of Sicily, enslaved people were never passive cogs in the machine. They were strategists, engineers, even diplomats, like the mysterious Ali ibn Muhammad, whose origins remain debated but whose impact is undeniable. When the Abbasids finally crushed the revolt in 883, they did so not just with soldiers, but with promises of amnesty, a tacit admission that brute force alone couldn't quell the demand for dignity. The Zanj legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Modern scholars tracing the rebellion's path have found pottery shards etched with symbols, possibly secret messages or maps hidden near old canal works. These fragments suggest a network far more sophisticated than the empire ever admitted. But perhaps the greatest testament to the Zanj isn't in artifacts, but in the truth they forced the world to confront. No empire, no matter how wealthy or well-armed, can forever chain those who refuse to forget they were born free. And as we turn to the high seas, where enslaved sailors turned the very ships that bound them into instruments of liberation, that truth only grows louder. On a moonless night in July 1839, the creaking wooden hull of the Amistad carried more than just human cargo, it carried a ticking fuse of defiance. 53 men and children, stolen from their homes in Sierra Leone, had endured weeks of suffocating darkness below deck, their wrists scarred by iron shackles. But when the cook taunted them with a chilling joke that they'd soon be chopped up and salted like meat, something inside them snapped. Using a rusted nail pried loose from the ship's timbers, Seng P, known to history as Joseph Sink, freed himself and the others. What followed wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a masterclass in resistance. They didn't just overpower their captors, they outthought them. Sink, a rice farmer turned revolutionary, ordered the Spaniards to sail east toward Africa by day, while at night he secretly corrected their course northward using the stars. For 2 months, the Amistad zigzagged up the Atlantic coast, a ghost ship with a crew of formerly enslaved men steering their own destiny. When they finally anchored off Long Island, exhausted and starving, they expected freedom. Instead, they found themselves at the center of a legal storm that would shake the foundations of international law. The courtroom sketches from their trial tell a story words alone cannot. Sink, standing unbowed in a borrowed suit, pointing to his scars as evidence of the brutality he'd endured. His testimony, translated through a chain of interpreters from men to English, forced a nation built on slavery to confront its own hypocrisy. The prosecution argued these men were property, purchased legally under Spanish law. But former President John Quincy Adams, defending them before the Supreme Court, tore that argument apart. By what law, he thundered, no man can justly claim ownership of another under the natural laws of humanity. What made the Amistad case revolutionary wasn't just the verdict, though the court's decision to recognize the captives as free men sent shockwaves through the slave-holding South. It was how the rebellion exposed the lie at the heart of global commerce. The transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed for decades, yet ships like the Amistad still operated with impunity, their human cargo disguised as black ivory on falsified papers. Sink and the others didn't just win their freedom, they forced governments to acknowledge that paper treaties meant nothing without enforcement. But the Amistad's legacy stretches far beyond that courtroom. In Cuba, where the ship had begun its doomed voyage, planters panicked. If enslaved people could seize a vessel, navigate it, and win in court, what stopped others from trying? Their fears weren't unfounded. Across the Caribbean, whispers of the Amistad Mutiny fueled plots in sugar mills and dockside taverns. In Brazil, authorities intercepted letters between enslaved dockworkers mentioning Sink by name. The rebellion had become a blueprint, proving that resistance could strike at the empire's economic heart, not just in fields, but in the very machinery of trade. And here's the twist history often overlooks. The Amistad captives didn't vanish after their victory. With help from abolitionists, 35 returned to Sierra Leone, where they founded a mission school. Among their students, the children of the very chiefs who'd sold them to slavers years earlier. It was a bitter irony, but also a quiet revolution, one that planted seeds of education and autonomy in soil once stained by complicity. The Amistad Mutiny wasn't an isolated act of desperation. It was part of a pattern, a thread connecting rebellions that targeted empires where it hurt most, their wallets. From the salt marshes of Iraq to the sugar plantations of Haiti, enslaved people had long understood that freedom wasn't just won with muskets, but by disrupting the systems that made their bondage profitable. And as we'll see next, some of history's most daring revolts didn't just attack plantations, they choked off the rivers of gold that kept empires afloat. The cane fields of Demerara in 1823 should have been silent at dawn. Instead, they echoed with the sound of thousands of feet marching in unison, not the measured steps of British soldiers, but the determined tread of enslaved men and women, their hoes and cutlasses held like weapons. For months, whispers had spread through the colony, rumors that the King of England had already declared them free, but greedy planters were hiding the news. When the rebellion erupted on August 18th, It wasn't the chaotic outburst colonial officials later claimed. It was a coordinated strike involving nearly 10,000 people across 55 plantations, all demanding what they believed was rightfully theirs: freedom. Missionary John Smith's diary paints a scene of eerie discipline. Enslaved leaders like Kwamina and his son Jack, a skilled carpenter, had organized the revolt with meticulous care. They avoided unnecessary violence, even posting guards to protect the wives and children of white overseers. Their goal wasn't massacre, it was justice. But when British troops arrived, their response was anything but restrained. Soldiers fired into crowds, decapitated rebels, and displayed their heads on pikes along the riverbanks. Smith, who'd merely preached about Christian equality, was arrested and sentenced to hang, dying in his cell before the noose could tighten. His crime. Witnessing the truth, the Demerara Rebellion failed militarily, but its political shockwaves were undeniable. When news reached London, the brutality horrified a public already uneasy about slavery. Newspapers printed excerpts from Smith's diary, forcing Britons to confront the reality behind their sugar-stirred tea. In Parliament, abolitionist William Wilberforce brandished a whip taken from Demerara, its barbs still crusted with blood. "This," he declared, "is the currency of our empire." The rebellion hadn't just exposed plantation violence, it revealed the hypocrisy of a nation that prided itself on liberty while profiting from chains. And here's the pivotal question: would the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 have passed without Demerara? Historians note that the rebellion forced Britain's hand, proving that enslaved people wouldn't wait passively for freedom to be gifted. The act itself was a compromise. Emancipation came with a catch, as planters received massive payouts for their lost property, while the freed were forced into grueling apprenticeships. But the message was clear: the empire could no longer ignore the cost of its wealth. Yet Demerara's influence stretched far beyond British shores. In neighboring Brazil, where plantations dwarfed those of the Caribbean, secret networks circulated accounts of the rebellion. Enslaved dockworkers in Rio, who unloaded crates of Demerara sugar stamped with the blood-stained marks of revolt, began organizing their own cells. Meanwhile, in Cuba, colonial officials tightened patrols, terrified that Guyana's fire might jump the Caribbean. Their fears weren't misplaced. Just a decade later, the Ladder Conspiracy, a plot involving enslaved sugar mill workers and free black intellectuals, would prove that the age of rebellion was far from over. What made Demerara different wasn't its scale or even its strategy. It was the paper trail. Unlike earlier revolts, this one played out in real time through missionary letters, court transcripts, and parliamentary debates. For the first time, the enslaved weren't just fighting in the fields. They were forcing their oppressors to defend their crimes in ink. And when those words crossed the ocean, they became weapons no army could suppress. As the sun set on Britain's slave empire, new dawns broke elsewhere. In the mountains of Colombia, escaped slaves had already built phalanx fortified cities that resisted Spanish rule for centuries. And deep in the Amazon, Quilombo communities thrived, their very existence a rebuke to the idea that freedom could be owned or granted. The age of rebellion wasn't ending. It was evolving, proving that courage, once unleashed, could outlast even the mightiest empires. The streets of Salvador da Bahia pulsed with tension in the pre-dawn hours of January 25, 1835. Beneath the rhythmic chants of Catholic processions, a cover for their true purpose, enslaved Muslim men moved like shadows through the winding alleys. Their turbans were tightly wrapped, not just as symbols of faith, but as hidden armor, layers of cloth meant to soften the blows of colonial swords. This was the Malayre Revolt, a rebellion so meticulously planned that its organizers had communicated for months in coded Arabic, scribbling battle plans on scraps of paper disguised as religious texts. When the signal came, a single gun shot nearly 600 men surged toward the barracks, armed with blades forged from plantation tools, and a conviction that shook the foundations of Brazil's slave empire. What made the Malayre Uprising extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its intellectual backbone. Many of its leaders, like the scholarly Ahuna and the carpenter Pacifico Licatan, were literate in Arabic, a skill their enslavers had dismissed as harmless piety. They'd penned manifestos quoting Quranic verses about justice, turning prayer into protest. One surviving manuscript, discovered hidden in a mattress years later, contained a chillingly precise battle map of Salvador's defenses, drawn by men who were supposed to know nothing of strategy. The Portuguese-speaking elite never suspected that the very education they'd ignored would become their undoing. The revolt lasted barely a day before being crushed by overwhelming firepower, but its aftershocks reverberated for decades. Terrified officials rounded up hundreds of suspected rebels, sentencing many to lashings, prison ships, or forced labor in the Amazon. Yet the trial transcripts reveal a startling detail. Interrogators relied on African interpreters, creating a bizarre echo chamber where the oppressed controlled the narrative. Some prisoners defiantly recited surahs in court, turning legal proceedings into acts of worship. The backlash was swift. New laws banned turbans, public gatherings, even the possession of ink. But the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. Economically, the Malayre Revolt struck at Brazil's weakest point, its dependence on enslaved labor. Bahia was the heart of the sugar trade, and the uprising sent global prices spiking as markets feared instability. Plantation owners, once confident in their control, began advocating for gradual emancipation not out of morality, but because they'd seen the cost of resistance firsthand. Within 50 years, Brazil would become the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery, but the Malayre had accelerated the clock. Yet the rebellion's true legacy wasn't just in laws or economics, it was in the cultural DNA of a nation. The Arabic manuscript survivors smuggled into hiding became sacred texts for future generations, blending Islamic traditions with Afro-Brazilian spirituality. Today, Bahian capoeira circles still echo with movements said to mimic the Malayre's combat techniques, while the region's famous acarajé street food carries the memory of enslaved women who sold snacks to fund the revolt. Even the word Malayre, once a colonial slur for African Muslims, was reclaimed as a badge of pride. This cultural resilience raises a profound question. Can any empire truly erase the identity of those it oppresses? From the Quranic schools secretly operating in Rio's favelas to the Yoruba chants that infuse Brazilian carnival, the Malayre proved that rebellion isn't just fought with weapons, it's preserved in language, cuisine, and rhythm. Their uprising didn't just demand freedom, it insisted on the right to be remembered. And as we turn to the final chapter of these forgotten rebellions, we'll see how their echoes still shape our understanding of justice, identity, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. Deep in the jungles of Veracruz, where the air hums with cicadas and the scent of ripe mangoes hangs thick, an enslaved man named Gaspar did the unthinkable in the late 1570s. He didn't just escape his chains, he built a kingdom. A prince from West Africa's Brand tribe before his capture, Yonga rallied hundreds of fellow escapees, forging a Maroon settlement so formidable that Spanish troops called it the Little Angola. For 30 years they thrived, farming fertile volcanic soil and launching raids on nearby plantations to free others. But Yonga's brilliance wasn't just in combat, it was in diplomacy. When the Spanish finally sent 500 soldiers to crush the settlement in 1609, The battle raged for days until Yonga, then an elderly man, did something no rebel leader had ever attempted. He negotiated. The terms he secured were extraordinary. His people would stop attacking plantations, and in return, they'd be granted their own free town, San Lorenzo de los Negros, later renamed Yonga in his honor. It became the first self-governing black community in the Americas, predating Haiti's revolution by nearly 2 centuries. Today, visitors wandering Yonga's sun-baked plaza might stumble upon a mural of the rebel leader, his fist raised beside the words, Prima Libertador de America, a first liberator of the Americas. Every August, the town erupts in carnival, with dancers in feathered headdresses reenacting battles to the thunder of African drums. Yet outside Veracruz, Yonga's name draws blank stares. Why does a man who outmaneuvered an empire remain a footnote? Some historians blame Mexico's later focus on mestizo identity, which downplayed African contributions. Others point to Spain's deliberate suppression of the story. Yonga's victory proved enslaved people could win against overwhelming odds. But the truth lingers in the town's cobblestone streets, where elders still recount how Yonga's negotiators leveraged the colony's deepest fear, that his rebellion might inspire the indigenous population to rise up too. By offering the Spanish a truce, Yonga didn't just secure freedom for his people, he exposed the fragility of colonial rule itself. The rebellion's legacy pulses through Mexican culture in unexpected ways. Veracruz's famous Son Jarocho music, with its West African-inspired rhythms and improvised verses, likely traces back to Yonga's Maroons. Folk tales speak of a cunning trickster who outwits slavers, a shadow of the real-life strategist who turned jungle trails into traps for pursuing soldiers. Even the annual Day of the Dead celebrations here feature sugar skulls adorned with Yonga's likeness, a sweet rebellion against historical erasure. What makes Yonga's story so revolutionary isn't just the battle he won, but the blueprint he left. His negotiated settlement proved freedom wasn't just seized, it could be bargained for, a lesson later rebellions from Jamaica's Maroon Wars to Colombia's Phalanx would emulate. And perhaps that's why empires worked so hard to bury his name, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. While statues of conquistadors crumble across Latin America, Yonga's greatest monument isn't bronze or stone. It's the unbroken spirit of a town that still bears his name, and the rhythms that refuse to be silenced. From these rebellions, art and folklore became weapons of memory. In Cuba, the legend of the rebellious slave José Antonio Aponte, a painter whose sketches of black kings and warriors fueled an 1812 uprising, lives on in murals across Havana. In Louisiana, the story of the German Coast Uprising, where enslaved men marched to drums disguised as work songs, echoes in Mardi Gras Indians' beadwork depicting warrior chiefs. These weren't just acts of resistance, they were acts of creation, proving that every rebellion left behind not just scars, but seeds that would grow into songs, dances, and stories too vibrant to ever be erased. The humid August night in Southampton County, Virginia, held its breath in 1831. Beneath the eerie glow of a solar eclipse, an omen Nat Turner took as divine instruction. A small group of enslaved men moved silently between plantations. Their mission wasn't just escape, it was reckoning. Armed with axes and blunt farm tools, they moved with chilling precision, targeting the households of their enslavers in a rebellion that would leave 55 dead and the American South forever changed. Turner, a literate preacher who'd memorized entire books of the Bible, saw himself not as a murderer but as an instrument of God's wrath. The serpent must be crushed, he later confessed, his words transcribed by a white lawyer as shackles bit into his wrists. What made Turner's revolt different wasn't its violence. Slaveholders had long used far worse, but its psychological impact. For the first time, Southern elites confronted the terrifying possibility that the very people they'd convinced themselves were content might be dreaming of vengeance. Newspapers screamed about black prophets and Bible-wielding fanatics, twisting Turner's theological rebellion into a demonic caricature. Yet abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison seized on his confession, publishing excerpts in the Liberator as proof of slavery's inevitable consequences. Turner's words became a Rorschach test. To some, they justified harsher repression. To others, they revealed a system so rotten, violence was its natural offspring. The backlash was swift and brutal. Over 200 black people, many with no connection to the revolt, were lynched by white mobs. Virginia debated ending slavery entirely, not out of morality but fear, before instead passing laws banning black literacy and religious gatherings. A single rebellion had exposed the paradox at slavery's core. The more brutally you oppressed people, the more likely they were to resist, and resist they did, though not always with blades. In the quarters, whispers of Turner's prophecy bled into spirituals like "Steal Away," its coded lyrics urging escape under the cover of night. But Turner's deepest legacy might be in the stories that outlived him. Folk tales spread of a man who could vanish into thin air, his Bible glowing like embers in the dark. Blues musicians decades later would hum melodies about the prophet's shadow, a nod to Turner's belief that his rebellion was just the first trumpet blast of judgment. Even the eclipse that preceded his revolt took on mythic weight, resurfacing in oral histories as a sign that heaven itself had blinked. The rebellion's echoes reached far beyond Virginia. In Louisiana, planters panicked at rumors of copycat uprisings, while northern abolitionists reprinted Turner's confession as a moral indictment. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the enslaved themselves. Diaries of plantation wives record unsettling new behavior, workers humming unfamiliar tunes, their eyes lingering a second too long on the master's knife block. Turner had proven something dangerous, that the line between prayer and revolt was thinner than anyone dared admit. And in that realization, the roots of a coming storm took hold. The first time "Wade in the Water" echoed through a southern cotton field. White overseers heard nothing but a harmless hymn, but the enslaved singers knew better. Every note carried a hidden blueprint for rebellion. The lyrics urging listeners to wade where God's gonna trouble the water weren't just spiritual metaphors, they were precise survival instructions. Harriet Tubman reportedly used the song to signal escape routes, its coded message warning runaways to stick to rivers and streams where bloodhounds would lose their scent. This wasn't music for worship alone, it was music as weapon, a lifeline woven into melody. Consider the genius of "Follow the Drinking Gourd." On the surface, a whimsical folk tune about celestial navigation. But the drinking gourd was the Big Dipper, its pointer stars leading north to freedom, while the lyrics' reference to dead trees marked actual landmarks on underground railroad routes. Historians tracing the song's origins believe it was taught by an underground railroad operative named Peg Leg Joe, who left the tune as a sonic map wherever he worked. The brilliance lay in its simplicity, a song even children could memorize, ensuring the path to liberation survived generations. When the Fisk Jubilee Singers first performed spirituals for stunned white audiences in 1871, they weren't just preserving culture, they were forcing America to confront the art born from its darkest sin. Their haunting rendition of "Steal Away" carried the same urgency it had on plantations, where the phrase "steal away to Jesus" doubled as a call to flee under cover of night. University archives now house slave narratives describing how overseers would demand cheerful work songs, unaware that the same melodies contained tempo shifts signaling revolt plans. A quickened chorus might mean weapons were hidden nearby, A sudden drop in volume could warn of approaching patrols. Yet the most revolutionary aspect of these songs wasn't their secrecy, it was their unbreakability. While slaveholders could confiscate drums or forbid gatherings, they couldn't silence voices raised in praise. This musical resistance relied on women as much as men. In hidden corners of kitchens and washhouses, black women like abolitionist Charlotte Fortin taught spirituals to children, embedding survival strategies in lullabies. When the Civil War erupted, Union troops marching through the South reported eerie choruses of "Let My People Go," rising from plantations often led by women whose names history never recorded. One such woman, an Arkansas cook named Aunt Sally, used hymn singing to cover the sound of filing through shackles. Another, remembered only as Sister Betsy in abolitionist diaries, would lengthen the final note of Deep River to alert her community to patrol movements. Their stories reveal a truth often overshadowed by tales of armed revolts. Some of slavery's most effective rebels carried no weapons sharper than their voices. The transition from song to outright rebellion wasn't always linear, sometimes it was explosive. Take the case of Dinah Neville, an enslaved woman in antebellum Georgia who turned a seemingly innocent hymn into the spark for mass escape. When she belted out "Go Down, Moses" with unusual fervor during a Sunday service, plantation records note that 18 field hands vanished that same night. Investigators later found the lyrics "Tell Old Pharaoh to let my people go" scratched into the bark of trees along their escape route. This musical resistance didn't end with emancipation. During the civil rights era, protesters reclaimed these same spirituals, their lyrics taking on new urgency. When Fannie Lou Hamer led marches in "Wade in the Water" in 1964, she wasn't just honoring ancestors, she was proving that oppression's oldest weapon, the human voice, could still shake the foundations of power. The songs had survived because the struggle had, their melodies carrying the same message across centuries. Where words are policed, music becomes the revolution. And speaking of revolution, if men dominated the battlefield, women often masterminded the war, a truth hidden in plain sight behind the quiet labor of maintaining rebellion's infrastructure. From Jamaica's Nanny of the Maroons to the unsung heroines who smuggled blades in bread loaves, their stories reveal that the fight for freedom was never just a man's game. The Blue Mountains of Jamaica seem to swallow sound thick with mist and tangled roots that trip even the most sure-footed soldiers. It was here, in the early 1700s, that Nanny of the Maroons turned the island's rugged spine into a fortress. Born among Ghana's Ashanti warriors, she'd been stolen across the Atlantic only to become the British Empire's most elusive nightmare. Witnesses swore she could catch bullets in her hands and redirect them back at redcoats, a legend that spoke less to magic than to the sheer terror she inspired. Her real weapon, the land itself. Nanny's Maroons escaped slaves who'd formed independent communities moved through the mountains like shadows. They dug camouflaged pits lined with poisoned spikes, strung vines across trails to snap riders from their horses, and communicated with abeng horns whose calls mimicked bird songs. When British troops stormed their villages, they found empty huts rigged to collapse, their food stores replaced with bitter cassava that left them vomiting. Nanny didn't just fight, she weaponized every leaf and raindrop, proving that terrain could be as deadly as any blade. Her statue in Kingston's National Heroes Park captures none of this cunning. The bronze figure stands serene, a musket and sword crossed at her waist, but the truth was far more inventive. Historical accounts describe her wearing layered petticoats stuffed with leaves to blunt bayonet strikes, and training her fighters to disappear into the bark of silk cotton trees, their bodies pressed so still, patrols would pass within inches. The treaties she eventually forced Britain to sign in 1739 didn't just grant freedom to her people, they recognized Maroon sovereignty, a concept so radical it sent shockwaves from Havana to Charleston. But Nanny's greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the culture she forged. Today, Rastafarians revere her as a spiritual mother, her resistance echoing in Nyabinghi drum ceremonies that once doubled as war signals. The Nanny town she carved from the jungle still stands in Portland Parish, where elders point to a hidden cave said to hold her original treaties. Even Jamaica's national motto, "Out of many, one people," carries her legacy, a quiet nod to the Maroons who proved unity could dismantle empires. Her tactics became a blueprint for rebellions oceans away. In 19th century Mauritius, runaway slaves vanished into the island's volcanic highlands, using Nanny's guerrilla strategies to evade French hunters. Indian Ocean planters panicked when rebels began leaving Ashanti symbols at plantation raids, a deliberate homage. And when the Malagasy rose against French rule in 1845, their leaders cited Nanny's treaties as proof that colonial powers could be forced to negotiate. The irony, while Britain celebrated defeating Napoleon, their own officers admitted Nanny had been a more formidable foe. At least Napoleon fought by the rules. The highlands of Madagascar simmered with quiet fury in 1845, as French planters expanded their sugar and coffee empires across the island they called the Red Island. But beneath the hum of cicadas and the clank of slave chains, a different rhythm pulsed, one passed down through generations in the lyrics of Hira Gacy folk songs. These weren't just melodies, they were maps. When the Malagasy people rose up that November, their rebellion wasn't a spontaneous explosion of rage. It was a meticulously orchestrated strike, its roots tangled in the very songs French colonists had dismissed as primitive chants. The spark came from a man named René Harrow, a former soldier who'd studied French military tactics only to turn them against their creators. His forces, armed with spears and flintlock muskets salvaged from shipwrecks, targeted not just plantations but the colonial infrastructure, burning bridges, sabotaging ports, and cutting telegraph lines. What terrified the French wasn't the violence but the precision. Rebels moved through the rainforest like ghosts, using Hira Gacy lyrics as coded signals. A verse about the heron flying at dusk might warn of troop movements. A chorus referencing the axe at the kapok tree could mark a weapons cache. For 3 brutal years, the uprising spread like wildfire across the island's central plateau. French reports from 1848 describe entire garrisons abandoned, their officers baffled by enemies who seemed to know their every move. The truth: the Malagasy had turned the colonizers' own tools against them. Christian missionaries had taught literacy to convert the populace, never suspecting their pupils would use it to study French battle manuals. Plantation overseers had recorded work songs to monitor productivity, unaware they were documenting rebellion's soundtrack. Though the French eventually crushed the revolt with overwhelming force, its cultural aftershocks proved unstoppable. The Hira Gacy tradition evolved into a living archive of resistance. Modern performances still include verses from the 1840s, their lyrics preserving names of forgotten heroes like Rabodo, a weaver who smuggled messages in the patterns of her cloth, or Ratsimilaho, a fisherman who guided rebel canoes through mangrove labyrinths. These songs did more than inspire, they became a chain of memory, linking the 1800s to Madagascar's eventual independence in 1960. The rebellion's ripple effects reached far beyond the Indian Ocean. In Paris, news of the uprising fueled fiery debates in the National Assembly. Abolitionist Victor Schouler brandished reports of Malagasy resistance as proof that slavery would always breed violence, helping push through the 1848 decree that abolished slavery across French colonies. Meanwhile, British abolitionists circulated lurid pamphlets describing the revolt, using France's bloody quagmire to argue against expanding slavery in their own empire. What made the Malagasy uprising unique wasn't just its blend of tradition and tactics, it was how it exposed colonialism's fatal blind spot. The French assumed their superior technology and civilizing mission would pacify the island. They never grasped that the very culture they dismissed, the songs, the oral histories, the kinship networks, had become weapons sharper than any bayonet. When Malagasy fighters painted their shields with Soratra symbols to deflect bullets, it wasn't mere superstition. It was psychological warfare, a reminder that the colonizers didn't understand the rules of this war any more than they could silence the land's heartbeat. Today, historians tracing the rebellion's legacy find eerie parallels in Madagascar's 21st century protests, where hip-hop artists sample century-old Hira Gacy protest lyrics. The 1840s revolt didn't just challenge French rule, it forged a template for anti-colonial resistance that would echo from Algeria to Vietnam. And perhaps that's why so few textbooks mention it. Some stories are too dangerous to be remembered. But in the highland villages where elders still teach children the old songs, the truth survives, not as history, but as a warning, a promise, and a lullaby all at once. Across Europe, the tremors of slave rebellions were reshaping politics in ways no ruler could ignore. British Parliament's corridors buzzed with panic after Jamaica's Baptist War. French financiers liquidated Caribbean investments following Haiti's revolution. The enslaved had become the unseen architects of a new world order, their defiance rewriting laws they were never meant to read. The cane fields along Louisiana's German coast were still slick with pre-dawn dew on January 8, 1811, when the first torch flared to life. Within hours, nearly 500 enslaved people, field hands, blacksmiths, even musicians, were marching down river toward New Orleans, their ranks swelling as they liberated plantation after plantation. Armed with hoes, axes, and a handful of stolen muskets, they moved with a discipline that terrified the planter elite. This wasn't a riot, it was an army. And their goal wasn't just freedom, it was to seize the capital and establish a black republic under Haiti's revolutionary banner. Local papers later dismissed the uprising as a disorganized mob, but plantation ledgers tell a different story. Rebel leaders like Charles Deslons, a mixed-race overseer who traveled between Haiti and Louisiana, had studied military tactics. Survivor accounts describe columns moving in formation, with scouts flanking the roads and drummers using coded rhythms to coordinate. The brutality of their retaliation, burning crops, smashing sugar mills, wasn't random destruction. It was economic warfare, targeting the very machinery that made slavery profitable. So why did this rebellion vanish from textbooks for nearly 2 centuries? Archaeology provides chilling clues. In 2010, researchers sifting through soil at the Andre plantation, where the revolt began, uncovered musket balls fired toward the big house, not from it. These weren't defensive shots, they were evidence of a planned assault. Even more telling were the pottery shards found along the rebellion's path, their West African designs deliberately placed at crossroads like markers. The enslaved weren't just rebelling, they were reclaiming space, turning the landscape itself into a map of resistance. The white response was predictably savage. Planters formed militia companies that executed captives on the spot, displaying heads on pikes along the river road. Official reports listed only 66 rebels killed, but slave narratives and private letters suggest hundreds more were massacred, their bodies dumped in unmarked levees. The cover-up was immediate. Judges who presided over trials had their records lost. Newspapers that initially panicked later downplayed the event as a local disturbance. By the Civil War, the uprising had been scrubbed from public memory, its leaders reduced to footnotes in plantation diaries, but the rebellion's ghost lingered. The new slave codes passed in its wake, banning gatherings, forbidding free black people from entering the territory, proved how deeply the elite had been shaken. And when Union troops marched through Louisiana 50 years later, they reported encountering elderly enslaved men who still whispered about the Great March. The uprising's true impact might be measured not in battles won, but in the nightmares it planted in the minds of slaveholders. Half a world away, another rebellion was brewing in the marshes of southern Iraq, one that would prove even mighty Islamic empires weren't immune to the power of organized resistance. The Zanj Rebellion of the 9th century would see enslaved Africans turn the Abbasid Caliphate's greatest strength, its intricate canal systems, into a weapon against it. But that's a story for another episode. The cobblestone streets of Salvador da Bahia trembled underfoot in 1830 as Yoruba war chants erupted from the slave quarters. This wasn't just another uprising. It was the ignition of a decade-long firestorm, a cycle of rebellions that would fuse West African spirituality with Brazilian resistance in ways the Portuguese could never unravel. The Bayer Revolt stood apart from other slave rebellions in one crucial aspect. They weren't fighting merely for freedom, but to preserve an entire cultural universe. Enslaved Yoruba Muslims and practitioners of candomblé turned Catholic processions into covers for secret meetings, hiding coded messages in the rhythms of atabaque drums and the folds of ceremonial white garments. What made these revolts so formidable was their deep roots in ancestral knowledge. Leaders like Manuel Caliphate, a Nego blacksmith, structured their rebellions around Odu Ifa divination versus ancient Yoruba wisdom that predicted auspicious dates for strikes. When rebels stormed Salvador's streets on the night of January 24, 1835, they did so during the festival of Bonfim, knowing Portuguese soldiers would be drunk and distracted. But their most ingenious weapon was language. Nego Yoruba, spoken fluently by enslaved communities but incomprehensible to overseers, became the rebellion's encrypted communication network. Plantation records later revealed terrified complaints about the enemy's cursed tongue, as colonists realized entire battle plans had been discussed in front of them. The aftermath of each failed revolt only deepened the resistance. After the Malayre Uprising of 1835, authorities banned African religious gatherings, forcing candomblé ceremonies underground. But the faithful adapted, syncretizing Yoruba orishas with Catholic saints Imanjá disguised as the Virgin Mary, Ogun as St. George. This cultural camouflage allowed traditions to survive, evolve, and ultimately flourish. Modern Bahia's vibrant candomblé terreiros and capoeira circles owe their existence to these acts of spiritual preservation. Even the rebellion's symbols endured. The white turbans worn by Malayre fighters became sacred garments in candomblé, their folds still tied in the same intricate patterns used to hide Quranic verses. Archaeologists working in Pelerinho's colonial buildings have uncovered startling evidence of this cultural resistance. Beneath layers of whitewash, 19th century murals depict Catholic saints with subtle Yoruba facial markings. Hidden compartments in old slave quarters contained aylk beads and divination chains, their patterns matching those still used in Nigeria's Ife region. The rebels hadn't just brought their gods across the Atlantic, they'd embedded them in the very architecture of oppression. Portuguese attempts to crush this cultural resilience backfired spectacularly. Each new repression banning drums, outlawing communal meals, only drove innovation. Enslaved women like Tia Sayata, a legendary candomblé priestess, turned kitchen utensils into percussion instruments, transforming rice pestles into surdo drums. Their culinary resistance was equally ingenious. A karajay, the sacred fritters offered to the Oryxos, became street food sold by former slaves, funding covert religious networks. What began as rebellion morphed into a cultural revolution that would shape Brazil's identity. The Bayer Revolt's true legacy lies not in their immediate victories, but in their unbroken chain of memory. When Bahian musicians today play samba reggae anthems like Farao Divinde do Egito, they're channeling the same rhythms that once signaled revolt. The capoeira roaders spinning kicks and evasive maneuvers, they're descendants of combat techniques honed in 1840s slave quarters. Even the city's famous Festa do Boa Morte, where black sisterhoods parade through Salvador in colonial-era garb, carries the quiet triumph of women who preserved ancestral rights under the watch of slave patrols. These rebellions forced Brazil to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can chain a people's bodies but not their souls. When abolition finally came in 1888, it didn't mark the end of African culture in Brazil. It revealed how deeply it had already taken root. The Yoruba proverb, "Exu opens the path," found new meaning here. Every failed revolt had cleared ground for the next until the path to freedom became impossible to close. And as we'll see next, this pattern wasn't unique to Bahia. From the Quilombos of Palmares to the Favelas of Rio, resistance kept reinventing itself, proving that oppression's greatest weakness is the creativity of those who refuse to be broken. The ink was barely dry on Haiti's declaration of independence in 1804, when the tremors reached London's parliament. A once unthinkable question now echoed through the halls of power. If 500,000 enslaved people could overthrow the richest colony in the world, what stopped the rest from doing the same? British abolitionist William Wilberforce brandished reports from the Caribbean like a hammer, slamming them onto his colleagues' desks. Every whip crack in Jamaica, he warned, is another spark for the next Haiti. The rebellions had done more than shatter plantations, they'd exposed slavery's fatal flaw. It wasn't just morally bankrupt, it was economically unsustainable when those in chains refused to stay still. Napoleon's disastrous attempt to crush Haiti became abolitionists' most potent argument. The French had lost 50,000 soldiers and an empire's worth of sugar revenue, a financial hemorrhage that made even pro-slavery MPs pause. Treasury records from 1807 reveal frantic calculations. Maintaining slavery required ever more brutal repression, and brutal repression bred ever costlier revolts. When Parliament finally banned the slave trade that year, it wasn't purely conscience driving the vote. As one Liverpool merchant admitted in his diary, better to surrender the trade than lose the colonies entire. But the true tipping point came with Jamaica's Baptist War of 1831. When 60,000 enslaved people rose up demanding the freedom they'd been falsely told was already granted. The brutality of its suppression, over 200 executed, including pacifist preachers, became a public relations nightmare. British newspapers printed eyewitness accounts of pregnant women flogged to death, turning popular opinion like never before. In Parliament, Thomas Fowell Buxton held up a rebels' manifesto demanding wages and Sundays off. "These aren't savages," he thundered. "They're workers demanding rights we'd claim for ourselves." Within 2 years, slavery was abolished across the empire, not from kindness but cold calculus. The alternative, as Prime Minister Grey noted privately, was perpetual insurrection. The ripple effects reached unexpected shores. In the American South, planters reading smuggled copies of British debates grew paranoid. Virginia's legislature secretly debated emancipating slaves to avoid the horrors of St. Domingo, while South Carolina tightened patrols, banning even the whistling of Haitian folk tunes. Brazil's emperor, watching sugar profits plummet after each rebellion, began quietly encouraging European immigration to replace slave labor. The enslaved had turned economics into a weapon, proving their bodies were more dangerous producing freedom than producing cotton. Modern historians still uncover these connections in forgotten ledgers. A British naval captain's log from 1833 describes intercepting a slave ship where captives sang a Creole version of Haiti's independence anthem. In Louisiana, archaeologists recently unearthed charred plantation ledgers from 1845, their columns of human prices scribbled over with calculations of militia costs. The numbers told a story no propaganda could spin. Repression's price tag was bankrupting the system. Yet the rebellion's greatest legacy isn't in laws or ledgers, it's in the unbroken line of resistance they inspired. When civil rights marchers in 1965 crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they carried the same determination as Haiti's revolutionaries to make oppression more expensive than justice. Today, Haitian Creole phrases surface in Jamaican dancehall anthems. Brazilian capoeira circles teach moves developed in slave quarters. These aren't just cultural artifacts, they're living proof that the fight for dignity never truly ends, it just reinvents its rhythm. The rebellions didn't just end slavery, they taught the world a lesson etched in blood and fire. No empire can forever profit from those who have tasted freedom. And perhaps that's why their stories were buried so long, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. The streets of Port-au-Prince in 2021 burned with a different kind of fire, not the torches of rebellion, but the smartphones of protesters live streaming marches demanding justice for Jovenel Moïse's assassination. When Haitian demonstrators chanted, "Nous si petit Toussaint," we are Toussaint's children, they weren't just invoking history, they were drawing a direct line from the revolution that birthed the world's first Black Republic to today's fight against foreign interference and systemic poverty. This isn't nostalgia, it's a living strategy. Haitian activists like Emmanuela Douillon point to their ancestors' playbook, targeting economic choke points, leveraging international pressure, and weaponizing cultural memory. They erased our victories from textbooks, she told the BBC, but we still plant revolution in our children's lullabies. Half a world away in Barbados, the government's 2021 decision to remove Queen Elizabeth as head of state wasn't just symbolic, it was the latest move in a centuries-old chess game. Prime Minister Mia Mottley's simultaneous demand for reparations from British slave-owning families echoed the unfulfilled promises of emancipation. Historian Sir Hilary Beckles, chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, frames today's reckoning as the final act of Nat Turner's rebellion. When Caribbean nations sue for trillions in stolen labor, they're using the same ledger books that once tallied human beings as property. Only now the numbers testify against the oppressors. Even the tactics of suppression remain eerily unchanged. When Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020 tore down statues of slave traders, critics dismissed it as erasing history. But as Jamaican scholar Veren Shepherd notes, the real historical erasure began when colonial powers whitewashed rebellions from official records. British archives from the 1830s revealed deliberate efforts to censor news of Caribbean uprisings, fearing it would excite the Negroes. Today's social media algorithms, activists argue, perpetuate a digital version of the same censorship shadow, banning posts about police brutality in Haiti while amplifying narratives of chaos. The through line is clearest in Haiti's fight for restitution. After the revolution, France demanded 150 million francs, equivalent to 21 billion today, as compensation for lost property. Haiti paid this debt under gunboat diplomacy for over a century, draining its treasury into French banks. When President Aristide renewed calls for repayment in 2004, a US-backed coup removed him within months. Economist Thomas Piketty's research reveals how these extracted debts still strangle development. The average Haitian today earns less than their ancestors did under slavery. Yet the rebellion's legacy persists in unexpected ways. During the 2020 George Floyd protests, marchers in Salvador do Bahia carried portraits of Zumbi dos Palmares alongside "I can't breathe" signs. In London, black protesters strategically blocked the Bank of England, an institution built on slavery insurance just as 18th century rebels had targeted sugar warehouses. And when Hurricane Matthew devastated Haiti in 2016, grassroots groups bypassed corrupt officials by organizing through voodoo temple networks, replicating the communication systems of Bauchman's rebellion. The question isn't why these stories were suppressed, but who benefits from their absence. A 2023 UNESCO report found that less than 2% of British school textbooks mention Caribbean slave revolts beyond passive mentions of abolition. Meanwhile, Haitian students learn about Toussaint Louverture alongside George Washington, but American curricula rarely reciprocate. This asymmetry isn't accidental, it's the cultural counterpart to the economic extraction that still defines global power. But the cracks in this silence are widening. When Kanye West claimed slavery sounds like a choice, the internet flooded with threads about the Haitian Revolution's battle tactics. TikTok historians dissect Jamaican Maroon treaties with the same fervor as celebrity gossip. And in Kingston's National Gallery, a 2022 exhibit juxtaposed 18th century rebel manifests with contemporary protest art, proving the past isn't just remembered, it's reloaded. As Haitian poet Daniel Legros Georges writes, "They buried our rebellions in unmarked graves, but forgot we planted them with roots deep enough to crack marble floors." The ledgers of empire tell a careful story, one where rebellions are dismissed as riots, leaders recast as bandits, and victories rewritten as disturbances. Colonial archives brim with plantation inventories and shipping manifests, yet search for accounts of slave revolts, and you'll often find only gaps. A British governor's report from Jamaica in 1832 exemplifies this erasure. A minor insurrection was swiftly contained, it declares, omitting the 6 weeks of guerrilla warfare that nearly toppled Kingston. This wasn't oversight, it was strategy. Suppressing rebellions required more than muskets, it demanded controlling the narrative, ensuring future generations would never know their ancestors' power. Archaeologists call this archival silence, the deliberate omission of inconvenient truths. In Rio's National Library, pages from an 1845 police ledger show scorch marks where officers burned records of the Malayre Revolt. Dutch colonial maps of Suriname label Maroon strongholds as uninhabited wilderness, despite European accounts describing thriving African-style villages. Even the language of resistance was sanitized. What enslaved people called freedom wars became servile unrest in official documents, stripping them of legitimacy. Yet the truth persists in unexpected places. Hidden behind the gilt frames of plantation portraits, conservators have found rebel manifests scrawled on the backs of canvases. In Louisiana, oral historians collecting stories from elderly residents in the 1970s uncovered memories of the German coast uprising, passed down through 7 generations, details absent from any textbook. Digital humanities projects now cross-reference ship logs, missionary diaries, and soil samples to reconstruct rebellions archivists tried to erase. At the University of the West Indies, scholars are stitching together fragments of court transcripts to identify executed rebels listed only as Negro No. 3 in trial records, Honoring these rebels today requires more than plaques or parades. It demands dismantling the myths that still downplay their impact. When tour guides in Charleston called Denmark Vessie's failed 1822 revolt a foiled conspiracy, they echo the slaveholders who framed organized resistance as criminality. Revision starts with language, calling Haiti's revolution what it was, a war of independence, not the Haitian Troubles, as some 19th century texts labeled it. It means teaching children that Nat Turner wasn't a madman, but a theologian who quoted the same Bible his oppressors used to justify slavery. Some of the most powerful tributes emerge from art. Jamaican painter Laura Facey's Redemption Song, Monument in Kingston Harbor, features two 30-foot bronze figures emerging from the ocean, their broken chains transformed into musical notes, a nod to how rebellion survived in song. In Bahia, capoeira masters teach moves derived from martial arts techniques disguised as dance, ensuring the combat strategies of enslaved ancestors remain alive in muscle memory. Even hashtags like #Hidden Rebellions on TikTok have become digital memorials, with users stitching together overlooked revolts from Barbados to Bengal. The ultimate rebellion against erasure may be this, refusing to let these stories be frozen in the past. When Haitian farmers today stage land occupations by quoting Toussaint Louverture's land redistribution policies, or when Brazilian favela activists invoke Zum by dos Palmeiras in fights for housing rights, they prove these battles never really ended. The archives tried to bury the truth, but as anthropologist Mitchell Rolfe Truelot observed, silences are never empty, they're filled with whispers. And those whispers are growing louder. Walk through London's Parliament Square, and you'll pass towering statues of Winston Churchill and Oliver Cromwell. Stroll through Haiti's Champ de Mars, and you'll find Toussaint Louverture on horseback, his fist raised toward the sky. The difference between these monuments isn't just style, it's a question of who gets to be remembered as a hero and who gets erased. For centuries, colonial powers built statues of conquerors on pedestals, while slave rebels were relegated to footnotes. But from the cobblestone streets of Port-au-Prince to the shores of West Africa, a quiet revolution in bronze and stone is rewriting that narrative. Take the case of Nanny of the Maroons. For generations, Jamaica's legendary warrior queen existed only in oral histories, her guerrilla tactics against the British preserved in folk songs and bedtime stories. Then in 2005, her face appeared on the $500 bill. 7 years later, a 7-foot statue of her gripping a musket and a copy of the Maroon Treaties was unveiled in Kingston's National Heroes Park. Compare that to the fate of Edward Colston, the 17th century slave trader whose Bristol statue spent 3 centuries looming over the city before protesters toppled it into the harbor in 2020. The contrast couldn't be starker, one memorialized by the state, the other drowned by the people. Grassroots efforts are filling the gaps history books left empty. In Ouidah, Benin, the Wall of Return stands near the beach where countless Africans were forced onto slave ships. Its stark concrete panels are etched with names not of kings or colonizers, but of rebels like Francisco Felix de Sousa, who turned against the slave trade he once profited from. Visitors press their palms against the sun-warmed surface, leaving fingerprints that mirror the ancestral names. Meanwhile, in Charleston, South Carolina, a proposed monument to Denmark Vesey, the free black carpenter who planned a massive uprising in 1822, still faces opposition 2 centuries later. City Council minutes reveal familiar objections. It might encourage division, one member fretted, as if justice were ever peaceful. Even the materials whisper truths. Europe's colonial statues are often cast in cold, unyielding bronze, their subjects frozen in poses of dominance. but Benin's Struggle for Freedom monument, depicting an enslaved woman breaking her chains, is made of terracotta, the same clay used for centuries in West African pottery. The choice is deliberate. This isn't a monument meant to intimidate, but one that invites touch, connection, even repair. Similarly, the Haitian sculptor Ludovic Bouz recreated Louverture's famous "I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man" speech in wrought iron, the metal once used for shackles now twisted into words of liberation. The fight over memory isn't just about art, it's about power. When Barbados removed Lord Nelson's statue from Bridgetown's Heroes Square in 2020, it wasn't erasing history. It was correcting it. Nelson had defended the slave trade. The square now honors Bussa, an enslaved man who led an 1816 rebellion. In Brazil, Rio's Valongo Wharf, where nearly 1 million Africans first stepped into slavery, was recently named a UNESCO site, not to celebrate the past, but to force a reckoning. Tour guides point out the Pretos Novos beads embedded in the pavement, left by descendants who still come to honor ancestors whose names were stolen. What makes these new monuments radical isn't their size or grandeur. It's their refusal to let resilience be forgotten. In Louisiana's Whitney Plantation, a haunting circle of 40 life-size statues commemorates the enslaved children who died there, their faces based on archival records. Visitors often leave toys at their feet, a spontaneous act of remembrance no official monument could mandate. From Ghana's Door of No Return to Alabama's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, these spaces don't just memorialize pain. They insist on something far more dangerous, that the people who fought back mattered, that their dreams weren't in vain, and that stone and metal can be weapons too, not of conquest but of truth. These rebellions were never just footnotes in history, they were earthquakes that cracked the foundations of empires and reshaped the world as we know it. Every time an enslaved person raised a fist or a voice, they didn't just fight for their own freedom, they tugged at the threads of power until entire systems unraveled. Think about it. Haiti's revolution didn't just free 500,000 people, it forced Napoleon to sell the Louisiana territory, redrawing the map of North America. The Zanj Rebellion didn't just disrupt the Abbasid Caliphate's economy, it exposed the hypocrisy of an empire built on forced labor. These weren't isolated acts of defiance, they were dominoes, each fall setting off chains of change we still feel today. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We've been taught to see history through the eyes of kings and generals, while the rebels who truly shifted the balance of power are often reduced to whispers. When we picture revolutions, we imagine grand battlefields or signing ceremonies, not the moonlit meetings where enslaved people plotted liberation, or the coded hymns that carried maps to freedom. That's no accident. Empires thrive when resistance is erased or branded as chaos. But dig deeper, and you'll find the real architects of change, the black carpenters who built rebellions alongside furniture, the Muslim scholars who turned Quranic verses into battle plans, the women who smuggled weapons in bread baskets while singing lullabies. So here's your challenge. Next time you hear about a revolution, whether it's 1789 France or 1776 America, ask the question they don't want you to: who else fought? Whose rebellions made those famous victories possible? The answers might surprise you. In Brazil, it was the Malayres. In Jamaica, Nanny's Maroons. In Louisiana, Charles Deslon's army of 500. Their stories are waiting, buried in parish records, etched into pottery shards, or preserved in the rhythms of capoeira circles and spirituals. And this isn't just about the past. From Haiti's fight for reparations to the statues finally toppling in town squares, these rebellions are still speaking. They remind us that freedom was never given, It was taken piece by piece by people who refused to forget they deserved more. So go look for their traces, find the rebel history of your city, your street, your bloodline, then come back and tell us whose name should we remember. Whose courage was scrubbed from the record? The comments are yours. Let's rebuild this history together. Traditional Maroon drumbeat rises, then fades into silence.